Welcome to Navigating Nutrition Research, video 13.1 on steps in developing and testing a questionnaire. First, you need to develop the research question or questions. They will help you to define your target population, set the objectives for the questionnaire, as well as operationalize the research question as actual survey questions. Last, it can help you to formulate possible hypotheses and how you will test them. Next, it's important to consider which survey method you want to use. Your choices are paper, electronic, and oral surveys. Paper surveys are like the course evaluations that you complete in college. Paper surveys can also be mailed to people, but unfortunately they're very easy to ignore, so you may not get a large response. Electronic surveys are becoming more popular and certainly are the least expensive of the three options. Oral surveys include two types. They may actually be face-to-face or on the telephone. They are very expensive, but they do work very well with longer or complex surveys. Your choice of methods will depend upon your budget, characteristics of your respondents, such as consider that your population is going to be the elderly. If you email them your survey, of course, many of them may not be using email, so you may not get a whole lot of responses. So you need to think about who your potential respondents will be and which method will work best with that group. Your choice will also depend upon the complexity or the length of your questionnaire, and of course the sensitivity of the information being requested. Typically, it's recommended not to use oral interviews when you have a lot of information that's sensitive. In that case, a paper survey or an emailed survey works a lot better. Next, you're going to need to pick your sample. The target population is the focus of your study. Part of the target population is the accessible or source population, and that's the group that you can get access to, such as if you're doing a study related to breast cancer, you might want to get access to a breast cancer registry or several registries. Then your sample, the sample is the actual people from the accessible population who you asked to participate in the study. To pick a sample, you're going to use either a probability sampling technique or a non-probability sampling technique. In a probability sampling technique, everyone has an equal chance or probability of being selected to participate in the study. Our first example of probability sampling is simple random sampling. Now, in simple random sampling, you're going to have a list of members of your accessible population, and every person on the list has a number. Then what you're going to do is randomly select individuals on that list using an online random sample generator or a table of random numbers. Next, we're going to take a look at stratified random sampling, which is really, it's the same as simple random sampling. It's just that first we're going to split up the population into groups or strata. And a group, for instance, would be perhaps based on age or gender. So first we're going to split up our accessible population by, let's say, age or gender, and then we'll do simple random sampling within those groups. Next is systematic random sampling. And here we're going to basically have a list of people again, and we're going to pick every nth, like every fifth. So let's say we pick every fifth person and it's after a random start point. So you may choose every fifth person after starting at the 23rd person on the list. And lastly, in terms of probability sampling, is cluster random sampling. Clusters are used when the population that you're looking at is widely distributed geographically. For instance, it could be clusters of schools within a county. So what we do there is we randomly pick just some clusters. Then we do random sampling within each of those clusters. Now we move on to non-probability sampling. And first we're going to look at a very popular method of sampling called convenience sampling. And convenience sampling is when members of the population are chosen simply because they're easy to reach and the researcher often has a comfort level asking them to complete a survey. It is the weakest form of sampling, but it is frequently used. For instance, when you see the people on the sidewalk there, you might think of maybe when you've been walking down a city street or in a shopping center where there are people who are just randomly selecting individuals to complete a survey. That's really what convenience sampling is. It can get a little more sophisticated in quota sampling. Now, quota sampling is similar to convenience sampling, but quotas or limits are placed on the number of people in the sample of a particular, let's say, gender or age, race, or other characteristic. Often the quotas are based on the proportions found within the population, such as 50% male, 50% female. So it's convenience sampling, but you are going to have quotas so that you don't wind up with a survey with 80% females and 20% males. There is also purposive or judgment sampling. This is where the researcher's judgment is going to be used to determine if someone that they might want to have in the survey, if that person is a good representative of the population. And then lastly, you have network or snowball sampling. This is used when locating respondents with the characteristics you want is difficult. Basically, when you ask a few respondents who are appropriate for the study, you ask them to direct you to further potential respondents. So typically your first few respondents are picked using purposive sampling, and then the remaining respondents are picked using network or snowball sampling. Now it's time to write some questions. And here are some guidelines. Number one, you want to make sure that every question that you write for the survey actually measures something directly related to one of the research questions. Any wasteful questions are not going to be helpful, and they're just going to lengthen the period of time when someone has to respond to your survey. Number two, consider if most respondents understand the question as it is intended. You will do some testing after you write up your survey to help with this issue, because you're going to have people test out your questions, and if there's a problem with it, they will tell you. Also, is each question, is it brief? Is it free of bias and free of double negatives? Is only one question posed? Avoid what we call double-barreled questions, which are really asking two different things at the same time, because that type of question is going to be impossible to answer. Also, will most respondents be willing to answer the question? That's another thing you need to consider, is the sensitivity of each question. Next, are specific time references included for questions that require recall? In other words, if you're asking them to recall something about their eating habits 5 years ago, you need to put in that time reference. Number 7, will most respondents have the information to answer the question? 8, does everybody who's answering your survey need to answer this question? Does the question provide a list of acceptable responses? And are the response categories both comprehensive and mutually exclusive? In other words, the possible responses, they should not overlap or conflict. As you write your questions for the survey, you also need to consider the different types of response formats that you could use. A common type of response format is, as you can see here, the Likert scale, and I'm sure you've answered questions before using this scale. Basically, on the left-hand side, in this particular survey, there's a statement. And in the Likert scale, the person has to basically rank how they feel about that statement. Do they strongly disagree? Disagree? Are they neutral? Or do they agree or strongly agree with the statement that's given? For instance, in this particular example, which was a survey given to physicians, on the left-hand side, you'll see number 1 was describe to an obese child's family members what a healthy diet should include. Then they had to basically rate how confident they were that they could do that using the Likert scale. The Likert scale is very useful when you want information about someone's attitudes or opinions. For example, some other formats include possibly a dichotomous format, which simply is a yes or no answer, or it could be a verbal frequency scale. For example, how many minutes do you exercise each week? You have to think about how are you going to break that up. Do you want the person to fill in the number of minutes that they exercise each week, or perhaps you just want to give them categories, such as seen here. They can pick 0 to 60 minutes, 61 to 120, and over 120. So this is an example of a verbal frequency scale. And you may also want to use a traditional ordinal rating scale. For example, how would you judge the availability of healthy foods in the school cafeteria? And somebody would simply rank it from excellent down to very poor. Now it's going to be time to sequence the questions. The first questions in your survey are very important. They should always be easy to answer, engaging to the respondents, and directly connected to the survey purpose. Also, you need to think about organization. You want to organize similar questions together and use section headings as needed to make it easier for the respondent to get through your survey. Also, try to, as much as possible, go from general to specific questions. And when testing knowledge, go from easy to difficult. Also, put questions on sensitive issues and demographic questions for the respondents. Put both of those at the end of the survey. If the issue is a little sensitive, someone taking your survey may get turned off and not answer the rest of the survey. So that's why we tend to put sensitive issues at the end. Demographic questions traditionally have been put at the beginning of surveys, but the truth of the matter is it kind of tires people out in terms of the number of questions. So it's more advisable to put those at the end of the survey. Next, you want to actually lay out your questionnaire so that you can see exactly what it's going to look like to your respondents. Some guidelines for that are always to use color with your headings, because that helps your respondents navigate their way through your instrument. You want to have at least 14-point, an easy to read type font, such as the font you see here in this particular slide. Some of the letters do have little feet or flourishes on them, and that's easier to read. Avoid words in all capital letters. If you have a heading, avoid the temptation to put it in all caps, because actually all capital letters is a lot harder to read than simply if you capitalize the first letter in each word. So avoid all caps. Also, use contrast between the question stems and the responses. Sometimes how this is done is simply that the question stems may be in slightly larger font, like a 16-point font, and the responses are in a smaller. That way it just adds contrast and it makes it easier and quicker for a respondent to get through the survey. Also, do not justify the right margin. When we do that, the right margin is all at the same location, and actually right justified text is a lot harder to read. You can see right in the slide as you go down it that the right-hand margin is the words end at different points. It's much easier to read that way. Also, number 6, use lots of white space, which is actually blank space. Make sure there is some blank space at points in your survey because blank space allows the respondents to navigate through the survey easier. And then lastly, any illustrations that you use, they should be simple and they should be realistic. And any illustrations of people that you use in a survey should be appropriate. They should reflect your audience. Now it's time to pre-test the questionnaire. Listed there are various things to consider when you're doing this. For instance, how long does it really take a respondent to complete the questionnaire? Are the instructions clear? Is there a logical order to your questionnaire? Is it easy to navigate for each respondent? Do any questions, are they unclear or have some type of issue? And last of all, you also always want to consider, is your questionnaire culturally friendly? There are various ways to pretest your questionnaire from the list on the right. In cognitive interviewing, you basically ask the respondents to describe all the thoughts, feelings, and ideas that come to mind while they work their way through your questionnaire. You may also even ask them for suggestions to clarify wording, for instance. Cognitive interviews are always completed individually. You also have debriefing. It's either going to be individual or group. In individual debriefing, a respondent takes the survey in its entirety. Once they're done, the researcher goes through each question with the respondent and asks open-ended questions to get feedback on what was helpful, what was confusing, and so on. In group debriefing, a group of respondents take the questionnaire and then sit together for a focus group to discuss the instrument. The researcher can see which issues may be larger or smaller by observing how many respondents chime in on them. You also want to look at reliability and validity of your questionnaire. Reliability refers to whether you get consistent results on repeated trials. One method that we use to test reliability is called test-retest reliability. And in this situation, we simply want respondents to take the test on 2 different occasions, and then we do a test, which is going to be usually the Pearson's correlation coefficient, to measure the reliability or the consistency between the 2 times they took that test. Also, for a questionnaire, you may consider looking at internal consistency reliability. And that looks at how well different questions measuring the same construct produce similar results. And the typical statistical test used for that is going to be the Cronbach's alpha coefficient, which can vary from 0 to 1. Typically, the higher it is, the better. So a coefficient of usually about 0.80 or higher is desirable to show that the different questions did produce similar results when they measured the same construct. You also need to test for validity or accuracy. 2 common ways that we test for validity are face validity and content validity. Face validity is a first step toward establishing an instrument's credibility. In the case of a survey, the survey questions could be reviewed by untrained judges, such as people like your potential respondents. They are asked to judge subjectively whether the format, questions, and procedures are clear and easy to use, and whether the instrument appears to measure what it is supposed to measure. Content validity is also subjective. Content validity looks at whether the instrument covers all the dimensions it is supposed to measure. Often we use subject experts to help with determining content validity. Next, we have criterion validity. This measures how well an instrument stacks up against another instrument or predicts something. Criterion validity can be subdivided into concurrent and predictive validity. Concurrent validity refers to the degree to which your instrument correlates with another previously established and valid instrument, perhaps a gold standard. Whereas predictive validity evaluates how well your instrument predicts a specific outcome. such as a survey asking adults about their attitudes towards healthy eating, which may predict the quality of their diets. Construct validity can be difficult to assess, but is very valuable. Basically, it looks at the question, does your instrument really measure what it is supposed to measure? Factor analysis, a statistical technique, may be used to determine an instrument's construct validity. Your last step is going to be to write a cover letter that goes out with every questionnaire. Things that you want to make sure you include in your cover letter, and of course the purpose of the cover letter is to try to get more responses to your survey. So first you want to make sure you include what is the survey about and why it is important, and also why is the respondent important to the study. Of course you need to mention the voluntary nature of participation and confidentiality of results. You also need to give them an estimate of the time that it will take to complete a survey. If you're giving some type of incentive, that should also be mentioned, and there should always be contact information for the people who are doing the survey, including a phone number and name in case the person has any questions.